We're live.
All right. Hello, everyone. Good morning from North Carolina. Todd's joining us from Texas, and we have a very special guest this morning, which we're going to introduce in a bit. But first and foremost, we want to welcome you to the Sparks in the Dark podcast. This is a place, once again, where we share ideas about reading and writing, and we try to probe the issues about reading and writing in our classrooms, how we can connect with kids and how we can reach them. How can we grow our students as readers? How can we grow them as writers? And we're so excited today to share with you a special guest and just join in some of that conversation.
My name is Todd Nesloni. I'm one of your co-hosts. I am an elementary principal in Texas, and half of this Sparks in the Dark duo.
Yes. And I'm Travis Crowder, and I'm a 7th grade language arts and social studies teacher in North Carolina, and I'm also glad to be part of the co-hosting this morning.
Now, we are so thrilled about our special guest today because this is an author that we picked up his book about a month or a month and a half ago. We shared it on a previous podcast, and it has just made such an impact on us. And so we are thrilled today to have Ian Thomas, author of I Wrote This For You, here with us today. So Ian, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
So tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us about you, the person, the writer.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, I've been writing in some way or another pretty much as long as I can remember. I think I had a diary from the age I was about 12 or 13. And I kind of just assumed everyone did. I just assumed, like when you're a kid, I think, whatever you're doing, you just assume everyone else is doing it. And I was quite shocked at some point to kind of have this experience with other kids where they're like, no, we're not keeping diaries. Like, you're weird for doing that. And it was something I really enjoyed. I was raised in like quite a very left-brain, very academic kind of household where my father had his doctorate in foreign accounting. My brother was, heavily into computers and technology. And I, wasn't. And so, the writing and the kind of creative side of things was kind of something that I could be good at. But I was raised in a small city called Port Elizabeth, which is kind of like South Africa's Detroit. Everyone's dad works in a car factory, and I wasn't really exposed to the idea of being able to become a writer or an artist or anything like that. Like those weren't, professions that you could really kind of consider. And so I ended up going into advertising as a copywriter because that seemed like a safe way to kind of make money and support myself and make sure I didn't end up in a cardboard box or whatever. Because I was always kind of like petrified that because I wasn't like very math orientated or very technology or left brain orientated like the rest of my family, that I was just really worried about my future. And so I thought, okay, cool, I can go into advertising, I can do this. And I went and I studied copywriting for a while. And I began a very successful career as a copywriter, then as a creative director in the advertising industry. I won a whole bunch of awards, and I worked, here in South Africa, in Amsterdam, in Europe. I worked in Los Angeles for a while. And it was great, but, what you kind of realize when you're in advertising, what you don't realize before you go in, is that it might seem like an area where self-expression is kind of, quite core to it, but it's kind of the polar opposite. It's you're kind of being creative within a very narrow and very focused kind of space. And so at some point, I really just wanted to do something that was effectively just for me. That was a way for me to kind of be creative and do something that no one else could change. And that's when I just started writing online. I started writing a whole bunch of different blogs, just a whole bunch of different kind of creative, projects and things. And eventually one of them became really famous and a lot of people started reading it. And it became a book. And now I don't work in advertising anymore. And I sit here at home and, write books. That's kind of what I do. That's it in a nutshell, I think. As small of a nutshell as I can.
I love all that you said. I want to speak to several things. One, I know what it's like to be a writer and to think that everyone around you is doing the exact same thing. I was notorious as a child for getting pieces of paper together, and I would actually needle and thread them together to make my own journals. I grew up in a very poor household, so we didn't have the going to buy a journal wasn't something that was, that would have been a luxury. So I was able to get some needle and thread and tie that, or stitch that together. And when I shared that with people and I was like, share with me your stories, they had none to tell. They had no writing to share. And so, you learn that, the life of someone who writes, that's something that lives inside of us. And some of us gravitate to it earlier. Others of us, or, other people may not find it until later in life. Maybe that needs to be birthed inside of them. So I love that you said that. I would like to ask you about poetry, about the type of writing that you write, about the books that you've written. Why was it that you decided to go with the theme that you did? What led you to unifying all of your writing, the pieces, under the one theme of I wrote this for you, please find this? What took you there? Could you tell us about the genesis of that?
Sure. It's a bunch of different factors that kind of led to where I ended up, and I'll try and go through them in some kind of order. So where the idea originally came from was I originally wanted it to be a kind of vehicle for storytelling, where I wanted to kind of be able to do these short bursts of writing. And the original kind of Venus de Milo, or Venus rising out of the oyster kind of moment happened one day when I'd driven back to my hometown to go and visit my parents, and I drove past my old school. And I thought, like, let me just drive through it just to kind of look at it and kind of like be a little bit, nostalgic about it. And this was after I kind of, had quite a successful career in advertising. I just bought a new car. I was feeling, quite self-congratulatory, I guess. But I drove past my old art teacher, and he was busy walking towards his car, and there was his car, and his car, was one of those cars that's put together from bits of other cars. Like every door is a different color, and it kind of, there was this moment where it kind of struck me that this guy would have this massive impact on my life, because, like, I think there are maybe 2 or 3 teachers when I was growing up in my school who kind of really took an interest in me, and this art teacher was one of them. And there was this strange dissonance between my successful life in advertising and this guy that had this massive impact on me. And I got out of the car and I had a conversation with him, and we just kind of reconnected. And as I was walking away from him, I had this thought, this idea that, like, whatever I want to do, creatively, I wanted it to be about somebody else than me. I wanted to, the kind of, the symbol for that is you. The symbol for, or the icon for somebody else is you in that. And so that was the kind of, the creative mechanic aspect of it. Because advertising is a super egotistical business. It's very awards driven. It's very kind of, who can come up with the biggest idea and who do the biggest, piece of work or whatever. And so that was kind of a genesis for it. And then on top of that, as I kind of started doing that, I started like writing these short pieces of fiction. They were kind of weird science fiction, magical realism kind of little pieces of writing. And they were okay, no one was reading it. And then I went through a breakup, like kind of as I'd written the first 10, 20 entries or whatever. Mm-hmm. And so I figured, like, you know what, no one's actually reading this. So it's okay. Like, I can just, I can exercise some of these things that I'm feeling, and I can kind of talk about them. Mm-hmm. And so I did. and it became quite popular. And then the other layer of it, like the kind of third aspect of it, is growing up in South Africa, identity is a very integral part of who you are in society. I guess it's the same in the world. But like, I grew up and I went to originally a whites only school. That was very authoritarian. I wasn't very proud of my government at that point in time. Then we had Nelson Mandela, and that was incredible. And but in our country, like when you create something, you're kind of infected by who you are and where your kind of standpoint in society is. And what I wanted to do was I wanted to kind of write something that was just universally true and could apply to anyone, no matter who they were. And so I made a rule for myself that I would never mention gender, I would never mention race, I would never mention geographical locations. I would only talk about what fundamentally made us human. And so, and so it was these three kind of different things that led me like to create this thing. And then, the other aspect of it, of course, is the fact that I had this friend in Japan that I met online. We used to hang out on the same kind of music forums in the early 2000s. We'd never met. And he was taking photographs, these beautiful photographs of Japan where he lived. And I said one day, can I use one of these photographs for this blog thing that I'm doing? And he said yes. And we've been doing that for more than 10 years now. We've still never met, but like,
wow,
we just kind of keep going. So yeah, I mean, in terms of like where the themes come from, where it comes from, it's kind of evolved over the years, because when I started writing it, I was 26 years old. And now I'm 37 and I'm married and I have a kid. So I'm drawing from different places when I write these days. And it's kind of constantly evolving, and yeah, that's what it is.
Well, I gotta say, the way that you wrote the book, and Travis can attest to this too. I love the way you just described it, how you tried to keep it very just what's the core of every person, because it felt, you called the book I Wrote This For You, but it truly felt like every story or every little piece that I read in there was like, oh my gosh, like I'm so connecting with these couple sentences. And then I go to the next page and it's like, and this one. And it was like, I'm highlighting this and I wanted to quote this and I'm taking pictures of this and that. And so I think you really hit the nail on the head. And I love that you included imagery with them, because everyone that I read, I would use the photo just to kind of drive that even deeper and think even more like, what connection, why was this photo chosen? How does it make me feel with what I've just read? Like, I think it's just such a great experience. And the book, like a straight read is an easy straight read through, but I found myself just like reading things and then just like sitting on that, even though it was just one page of text, just having to really digest it and really take it in. And I find too that it's, I don't pick up a lot of books and reread them. I like to read books once, then go on to the next one. But this is a book that I find myself picking up again and again and again, just to find little moments of inspiration or peace or feeling like connection. So I think you really hit it on the head with that. When this came out, did you have a lot of really positive feedback right away, or did this kind of take some people getting used to?
I had an existing audience at that stage. A few thousand people on Twitter and a few thousand people on Facebook when the book came out. And so they were there, but I was also like, I was petrified, when the book was coming out, because I figured, that, it's fine to do this weird arty thing that you're doing online, like no one really cares about it or whatever. But and I think this is a fundamental thing to writers or artists. I had this idea that there's this army of critics out there like waiting, and if you have the goal to actually publish something and put it like down on paper, then you'll be taken to task, for it. And I remember actually the night before the book came out, I was like, ego surfing and Googling myself in the book to see if anything had been said yet. And I found like one review, and and it was the most negative thing I could ever have read. Where it was this this woman who said it read like something her ex-boyfriend would have written in blood, and I was like, I was convinced that I was going to wake up in the morning and there was just going to be like a mob with torches outside my front door. Like, how dare you put this thing out into the world? And then I woke up the next morning after it had been properly released, and it was a #1 bestseller in the Amazon poetry section. It was a #1 bestseller on iTunes in their iBook section, and that was a pretty good day. I think I had a good cry. So yeah.
That's amazing. I want to speak to something that Todd mentioned. I was in Barnes and Noble when I first saw your book, and I picked it up, and the cover of it to me was gorgeous because it resonated. It was almost like it spoke to me, and I thought, this is something I want to read. This is something that I want to pick up and start leafing through. And as I picked it up, I started leafing through it. This is really weird, but I like to smell books too. I feel like I connect with them when I do that. But I was just standing there at one of the end caps in Barnes and Noble, and I was just leafing through your book, and then I looked at it. I saw the way that it was written, which I thought was neat, which I have used as quick writes with students, which I want to talk with you about a little bit later. But I noticed, I went back to the beginning of it and I started reading it, and I must have read 20 pages standing there, and I immediately started crying. And I get back to my apartment, I text Todd, and I tell him I found this book, and I took a picture of it and I sent it to him, and I said, you've got to get this, you've got to read it. Because at that time I was going through a very emotional breakup, and it felt like everything in there was speaking to me. I started crying on page 5, we'll say, and cried through the rest of it. It was a good cry. All right. It was like, this is what I needed to hear. This, poems or short bursts of story, however it is that you want to characterize it, there was self-generosity that I saw in it. There was love that I saw in it. There was self-worth, self-actualization, if you will. And that's something that exists, but not in this format. And that's what I so loved about it. I really did. So thank you. I promise I won't fangirl you too much. I'd like to ask you, though, about the strikeouts, the time where you've written something and it didn't resonate with you, it didn't resonate. Have there been times when, I know there have been, because that's the nature of writing, but would you share some of that with us? Talk about the times where the writing didn't resonate with you, or you put it out there and you didn't feel as though it touched people in the way you wanted it to.
Well, I think, the creative process is the act of kind of buying lottery tickets. You do not know ever what's actually going to pay off. I've discovered that, like, if I look at what my most popular work is, often my most popular work is stuff that I haven't really been that focused on. I'm literally kind of thinking to myself, I need to write something today. I've kind of got half a sentence here. Let me just put it together and see what happens. Other times I'll spend the entire day like slaving away on something, writing a page and then condensing it down to like 3 or 4 lines, and I'll send it out into the world, and the world will kind of go, yeah, that's interesting. And the lesson in that is the fact that, like, even after doing this for 10 years, even after having my voice, kind of being refined for 10 years within that project and within that book, I still, to this day, when I wake up and I start writing, do not know if what I'm writing is going to resonate with you. I have some kind of, guiding lights, like, if it resonates with me, then generally it'll resonate with people else. But there's no kind of sure thing or whatever. If there was a formula, I'd love to know. I don't. That is the act of living a creative life is that you just wake up every day and buy lottery tickets. That's all you can do. I've lectured at my old ad school once or twice. And I always kind of end the lecture on the fact that 9 out of every 10 things we do will fail. I have that big slide, and then the next slide is always, which is why we do 10 things.
Love that.
Before there was I Wrote This For You, there were 5 or 6 other blogs. There were, there were a bunch of other weird and wonderful writing projects that I started that, for whatever reason, didn't get popular, didn't get traction. And so that's every day I'm running that risk, and that risk is fine. It's something that you have to accept. Like I'm busy on a new book right now that I've sold in North America, and it's the first time I'm putting together a collection of work that hasn't appeared like on social media. So it's terrifying. It's absolutely terrifying because I don't have the reassurance that I normally have, where it's like, I've published these 500 poems or whatever, and people like 200 of them, so I'll put those together in a book. Now I'm kind of going, okay, cool. If I had to consider the book as this holistic thing, without anyone looking at it beforehand, what is the most beautiful thing I can make? And I have to hope that lottery ticket, wins. It might not, but
Right.
Love that. So talk to me a little bit though about your education growing up. So as a kid, did you have teachers and other adults in your life that kind of encouraged your writing, or was it just something that was like an escape for you, like you just carried your writing journal around with you and things like that, or was it built into you in school too?
It wasn't really something that came from school. I think before I consider myself a writer, I consider myself a creative person, and writing happens to be the instrument that I play. Like as much as somebody is a musician, and they might be good at drums, or they might be play bass guitar or piano or whatever, like writing happens to be the outlet that I have. When I learned what I learned from school, I learned from people, like my art teacher.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, like I didn't have the best experience at school because it was a very kind of authoritarian school, and this was towards the tail end of apartheid. We had like military training twice a week. We would like come to school in like army uniforms and march. And so if you have the genetic predisposition where you are effectively a sensitive soul or whatever, then that's not really conducive to you, and that kind of forces you to find escapes and writing and painting and like just generally making stuff. But yeah, there were a few teachers, but they weren't necessarily my English teachers. They were just teachers who kind of were either my art teachers or just teachers who took an interest in me and kind of like said, it's okay, there's something out there for you that you will be good at. Because I wasn't really that great at any of it. So yeah, I mean, and then my kind of journey with education today is like I try and continuously still try to be learning in some way or other. Like the rise of massive like open courses and things like that has been incredible. Like because I didn't have the faith in myself in terms of being able to just go out and study and become a writer and become an artist. I've been able to go back and online and do like theory of literature courses and that kind of stuff where I'm teaching myself stuff that I wish I'd known when I started.
Wow. So speaking about the classroom and speaking about education, one of the things that I do with my classroom is I really promote reading and writing inside of my classroom, not just because I am a language arts teacher, because that's what I'm, an English teacher, that's what I'm supposed to do, but also because I know that that is how kids connect. That is just it's a beautiful way for kids to connect with their world. And if we want students to write meaningful things. We have to give them chances to write, but we also have to give them chances to find writing. And one of the things that I've done with my students is I try to read some form of poetry or an excerpt from a text every day, and it's not for analysis. It is, well, it leads to that. But what it is it's a chance for them to, I'll put a poem underneath my document camera, or I'll display it on my board, and I'll read it aloud to students, and I'll ask them to choose a line that really stood out to them and write that in their writing notebooks and just write from it as quickly as they can, the things that come to mind. I even give them, and we call that a quick write. Then I'll give them a chance to quick draw, which is just create an image, draw something in your notebook that this really provided. Some of them want to connect it to books that they've already read. Some of them want to talk about how it applies to their lives. Some of them want to take an idea and just chase it in their writing. And I always go back to what Don Murray said, which is we write to discover what we want to say. So I'm going to now turn that into a question for you. What are some of the things that you do to help find your writing? Things that, and I would love you to phrase this in a way that teachers could use this too. What are some things that you do that would be beneficial for teachers to do in their classrooms so that their students could find writing, chase ideas, get some thinking down on paper that would then generate more writing, generate better writing?
Sure. Yeah, I think the most important thing that I do is that as a writer, I think you always need to be listening to people and need to well and truly hear them, because I have conversations every day, whether I'm going to like the grocery store down the road or I'm speaking to a friend, and they will say something, like they will just say, a sentence that they don't realize is incredibly profound if you just put it on its own. Something that is incredibly beautiful if you actually just think about it for a second. And people do this every day. People have conversations, but unfortunately, the nature of the human condition is like often when we're listening to somebody, we're trying to work out what we're going to say. We're not actually listening. And so for me, one of my key things is like to always try to be listening to the world. And the way that I can put that into a practical example is, or show how I use that, is I have like 2 or 3 massive Google documents where if I think of something or if I hear something, I'll immediately write it down. I carry 2 or 3 different notebooks. I have one like that big, and that big, depending on how far I'm traveling away from the house. Or I'll just put it down in my phone's like note app or whatever. I'll wake up at 3 a.m. and I'll write down something. Like if I heard it in a dream or if I was just thinking something. Because all those things is there are seeds. There are seeds like to bigger pieces of writing and to better things. Sometimes they're fully formed and the thing is just there. Other times it's just the first sentence or the last sentence of something. You don't know what it is. So I mean, my advice would be like, get your students to carry, a notebook or to keep, something in their note app where they're just either writing down their own like little one sentence things that, that they think of or that they hear from somebody else, because, the other thing is that I do is kind of like your quick writes process where I will sit down and I will almost kind of stream of consciousness write. I'll just sit and I'll won't think about it. I'll write until I've filled like 2 or 3 pages. And if I go back, like 90% of it is garbage. It's just, like don't forget to buy milk. But there's 4 or 5 things in it that like could become something else. There's someone much smarter than me said, inspiration is for amateurs. The rest of us just go to work. And like that's kind of what you need to do with your writing, where you can't always wait until, oh, I'm inspired today. Today's the day I write. Like if, you're paying your mortgage with the proceeds from your writing, you wake up every day and you go to work, you sit down and you write. Yeah. And I mean, like, I think, with any kind of creative process, whether you're writing or you're drawing or you're sculpting or whatever it is that you're doing, it can kind of be divided up into two parts. The one is the very messy part, you know, at the front, where you can't edit yourself at all. You cannot stop and like fix a spelling mistake or change the grammar or whatever. You know, you just have to kind of get through that. And then there's this other part of the process where you have to be brutal and analytical and cold and just, you know, slice away everything that doesn't work. You know, there's a philosophy which is write hot and edit cold, you know, and you kind of have to give yourself space for both of those processes. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if that helps you at all, or if that's
Yeah, that was awesome. Thank you so much. So, you know, we always like to end every one of our shows with sharing some book recommendations. So, is there a book that you've read recently or that's on your to-read list that you would recommend to our viewers and listeners?
You know, a book that changed my life, it's not something that I've read recently, but I do go back every few years and I do read it. It's Tuesdays with Morrie. It's not a very like kind of cool niche pick or, you know, or obscure cool thing or whatever, but like I read it in my early 20s, and which is when it was a bestseller, when it first came out, and you know, the lessons in it and the kind of principles in it that about how to live your life, like about how to be a better person and a kind of person, have, you know, fundamentally changed me. I try to keep going back.
That's a good one. Travis?
Cool. All right, sorry. I had to unmute myself. There's a little bit of an echo on my end, so I was trying to mitigate that. I really appreciate all of the stuff that you've given us today, the stories that you've told, the stories about your writing, the stories about your life, the stories about teaching. And one of the things that I really like, that I really want to put into my classroom and take back to my classroom, is this whole idea of just writing. Don't censor yourself as you write. And that's difficult. That's difficult for me. That's difficult for a lot of writers, to turn off our internal editor. Because I know that whenever I write, my biggest fear is, or not my biggest fear, but I guess I've trained myself to start thinking, you know, that's the wrong word. There's a better word for that. Let me look at synonyms for this word. I've used that word. But if you just get all of it out on paper, if you just get it there, then you have something to go back into. And what I've tried to start doing with students is I'll say, just, you know, get all your thinking inside of your notebook, get it there. And then I give them some time once we're finished to go back and highlight good thinking. You know, what came out of this? What pieces of this seem to be elevated above everything else? And I absolutely love what you said. That's something I can't wait. I can't wait to use that next week. Well, Ian, we're so glad that you joined us today. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing from your heart. Thank you for writing from your heart. And thank you for giving us a beautiful book. This is one that I have read and I've reread. I've shared it with students. I've given it to coworkers. I've given it to people outside of the classroom, just because I feel I know it's one of those books that will resonate with them. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for telling us about your writing process, and we are so happy that you were here with us to share on Sparks in the Dark today.
Thank you so much for having me, and have a great night. Thank you for your kind words.